The year was 2007. Mexico was at war, but it wasn't just the government and the cartels anymore. The conflict had triggered something deeper, something more dangerous. In towns like Nuevo Laredo, Monterrey, and Reynosa, the rules of the game had changed. Cartels were no longer just fighting for territory. They were adapting, fast. The federal government had pushed the army into the streets. The cartels responded with convoys, ambushes, and military-style tactics. This wasn't random chaos. It was evolving into something closer to insurgency. And at the center of that evolution was a group unlike any other. A group that didn't just fight like soldiers, they were soldiers. They were known as Los Zetas. The rise of Los Zetas didn't begin in 2007. It began years earlier, quietly, and within the system itself. Throughout the 1990s, the Mexican Army's elite forces, specifically the Airborne Special Forces Group, GAFE, were trained in counterinsurgency, jungle warfare, and special operations. Some of them even received advanced instruction from U.S. military advisors and Israeli specialists. But something went wrong. Cartels, particularly the Gulf Cartel, saw opportunity. They weren't just recruiting street gangs anymore. They wanted professionals. They wanted men trained to kill, survive, and command. And they found them. Between 1997 and 2001, at least 30 elite soldiers deserted the army and defected to the Gulf Cartel. They weren't ordinary deserters. They brought tactics, discipline, encrypted communications, and advanced weapon handling with them. They formed an armed wing that operated as a paramilitary force, not a traditional cartel. They called themselves Los Zetas, named after the military radio code used by federal police commanders, Z. And their first role wasn't trafficking drugs. It was eliminating enemies. Under the command of Ojirel Cardenas Gillen, the Gulf Cartel was expanding rapidly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But with expansion came enemies, rival cartels, federal agents, and local police. Ojirel needed protection. He needed force projection. So, he made Los Zetas his personal army. They ran protection convoys, executed rivals, trained cartel recruits, and performed high-value assassinations. They used military-grade weapons, tactical formations, and intelligence-gathering techniques unheard of in the criminal underworld at the time. They didn't just fight. They sent a message. We are the state now. By 2007, the war had changed everything. The Gulf Cartel, once dominant in the Northeast, was under pressure. U.S. forces had arrested Ojirel Cardenas in 2003, and by 2007, he had been extradited to the United States. Without its leader, the cartel began to fracture. Los Zetas, once bodyguards and enforcers, saw an opening. They had the firepower. They had the training, and now they had territory. In cities like Nuevo Laredo, they were no longer just enforcing the Gulf Cartel's rule. They were collecting their own taxes, running their own labs, building independent smuggling routes. The student was becoming the master. Los Zetas didn't operate like traditional cartels. They didn't rely on family loyalty or rural alliances. They relied on shock, beheadings, public executions, bodies hung from bridges with messages carved into skin or painted onto sheets. They used terror not as a byproduct of violence, but as a deliberate tactic, a message to rivals, civilians, and the state. This is what happens when you resist. By 2008, their tactics had begun to spread. Other cartels, like La Familia Michoacana and Beltran Leyva, adopted similar displays. But the Zetas were always a step ahead. They weren't drug traffickers in the traditional sense. They were mercenaries running a criminal empire. As the Calderon government intensified its crackdown in Michoacan and Sinaloa, the Zetas took advantage. While the military focused on West and Central Mexico, the Zetas expanded east, into Veracruz, Tabasco, and the Yucatan Peninsula. They didn't just move product, they took over towns. Using their experience in logistics and intimidation, Zeta commanders captured local police departments. In some towns, officers were executed and replaced overnight. In others, they were simply put on the payroll. Prisons were overrun. Judges disappeared. Local media silenced themselves out of fear. By 2009, Los Zetas had become a national force, not just an enforcer wing, but a cartel of their own. By 2009, Los Zetas were no longer just defectors or enforcers. They were building a war machine. They began recruiting not only former soldiers, but also corrupt federal agents, local cops, and even Cartels, Guatemalan special forces known for their brutality. In some towns, Zeta recruiters offered young men two options: join us or disappear. They structured their organization like a military unit. Command chains, regional commanders, armored convoys, a dedicated intelligence arm. Their expansion model was clear: invade, dominate, terrorize, tax. They didn't just move cocaine. They diversified: extortion, kidnapping, fuel theft, illegal mining, human trafficking. Where the Sinaloa cartel tried to buy loyalty, Los Zetas forced submission. But their rise came at a cost, especially to their original masters, the Gulf Cartel. Tensions had been building for years. The Zetas wanted more autonomy, more power, and more revenue. The Gulf Cartel saw them as a tool that had gone rogue. The rift remained quiet until 2010. That year, a minor dispute between the Zetas and a Gulf Cartel cell in Tamaulipas escalated. A Gulf commander killed a Zetas member. The response was immediate. Zetas operatives launched coordinated assaults on Gulf Cartel convoys, stash houses, and safe zones. The alliance was over. A full-blown war erupted across Nuevo Leon, Tamaulipas, and northeastern Mexico. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Cities like Reynosa and Matamoros became war zones. Entire neighborhoods emptied out. Local police forces were decimated. The Zetas were no longer cartel enforcers. They were cartel kings and enemies of everyone. The Mexican government had once thought Los Zetas were just a violent wing of an older problem. They weren't. They were the next phase of cartel evolution, one the state had unknowingly helped create. Trained by the army, forged in a war, hardened by betrayal, Los Zetas would go on to fight the Sinaloa cartel, La Familia, the Mexican military, and even themselves. Their story is not one of collapse, but one of mutation. From discipline to terror, from protection to domination, and their war was just beginning. By 2010, Mexico was no longer fighting a single war. The government was at war with the cartels. The cartels were at war with each other. And Los Zetas, trained by the state, unleashed by war, had become a force no one could control. In towns like San Fernando, Reynosa, and Monterrey, the Zetas operated like an occupying army. Checkpoints, torture houses, mass graves. Their war with the Gulf Cartel bled into cities. Their feud with Sinaloa became a national crisis. And their hunger for power turned even allies into enemies. What began with a defection had become a disaster. But the worst was still ahead. In the next episode, discover how Los Zetas took on everyone: the Gulf Cartel, the Sinaloa Federation, and the Mexican state itself, triggering some of the bloodiest years in Mexico's modern history.